Not then, I think, China, but that doesn't invalidate the same point. And, he said, the British Empire is undoubtedly using India for what I would call extractive reasons, converting its people and raw materials into capital without very much concern in order to finance the British Industrial Revolution. Nonetheless, this has brought to India, he enumerates them, the railway, the printing press, he thought that was of the highest importance, the telegraph, and steamship communication with other cultures. It's ended the millennial stagnation and isolation of India. But all of this is to the benefit of the Indian people, and it also means in the end they will be able to have their own modern, relatively modern, prosperous, post-British state. Actually, not only was it the correct analysis at the time, which left out nothing by way of a critique of the way the British treated their subjects, but objectively it was quite a good predictor of what India is now. Yeah. The British record in Ireland doesn't strike me that way at all. I mean, and parts of West Africa and elsewhere. I don't think one can say that it harnessed the energies, emancipated the labour force and savings or any of this sort of thing as it did in India. Mm-hmm. And I hope my accent doesn't betray me or compromise me, but I still think, a good case to be made, if you have to be colonised, don't be colonised by the Belgians. For one thing, it's a terrible thing to be colonised by a country that's already practically a colony itself and backward and impoverished and narrow. And best of all, is to have your own free economy and free institutions and an alliance with other countries that have the same. The Anglosphere is a prefiguration of that, I suppose, rather imperfect, rather inexact, but not bad. Mm.
The least bad of the...
And just to give you an example of how the promptings of the left don't leave me, or I don't think can be left out of this either. South Africa wasn't, in fact, English-speaking entirely. It was an Afrikaner-dominated and Dutch-run totalitarian system, in my opinion, because I think racism is totalitarianism by definition. Run by people whose party leadership had actually been on the other side in the Second World War. And I would say, if I'd been asked as late as the 1970s, a worse place to live in and a worse disgrace to human values than, say, Cuba was, or even is now.
South Africa.
Yes. So that the separations aren't all that easy but to make. They're not that difficult either. Mm-hmm. And then I would have added, and I should have said it already, I always thought, and I still think, that a nuclear war would be worse than any possible political outcome. It would be totalitarianism defined for the survivors. We're back to the most appalling tyranny of scarcity and famine and want and ruin. That's self-evident, but it would also be the end not just of our generation, but of all the generations that have come before us to build civilization. And so my anxiety to avoid anything that could lead to what was pathetically, wickedly, I thought, euphemistically called a nuclear exchange, was very strong and still is. And one would, in the better dead than red calculus, have no difficulty at all deciding. And don't forget, there were people at that time who honestly did think that the risk of that was worth running. For Cuba, for heaven's sake. Even for Vietnam in the 50s. And then I thought was the spirit of fascism transmuted into the discourse of the West. And I was very much against it, and I don't regret that one bit.
Since we're on that topic, do you think a nuclear Iran can be contained?
No. I don't think, actually, a theocratic Iran can be contained even without nuclear weapons. I think there's a confrontation in our future between our civilization, I'll say that without embarrassment, a world that at least respects, if it doesn't always practice, the rule of law, and that has devised certain forms of diplomacy and certain systems of arms control to which the Iranians are legally signatories, and a regime that has the clearly expressed ambition to break out of and to trample all those conventions. We already see it in the threats to their Arab Sunni neighbors in countries like Bahrain. in their export of violence, as far away as murdering Jewish community leaders in Argentina, or Kurdish exiles in Berlin and Vienna, for heaven's sake, or a novelist friend of mine living in London writing fiction. I think they've asked for a fight and should know that on those conditions they certainly will get one. I was at the Hezbollah rally, well, so were you, in Beirut a little while ago, and I couldn't but notice that the party symbol of Iran's main client in that country, Hezbollah, is now a nuclear mushroom cloud. In cartoon form, the cartoon is made up of words which, when decoded, constitute a threat to the Jewish state, the Jewish people. Well, I wouldn't want to look back and think, I wonder if I should have paid attention to a threat like that. You may say one is alarmist. I could give you also all the reasons why that could be a bluff. They don't have it, they just want you to think they do. It's a way of aggrandizing themselves. I know that's all partly true too, but behind it there's a reality, and the reality would be the emergence of a thermonuclear theocracy. The one thing we've, since I was at school, been lying awake worrying about what happens when apocalyptic weaponry is grabbed hold of, laid hold of by messianic totalitarian forces. Well, we are about to find out. If we want to run that experiment, they're ready to do it for us.
So that's the worst. There are no consequences of an attack.
No consequences could possibly be worse than that, because I'm not one of those who thinks they would immediately use it on the Israelis, let alone on the United States. I think they want it for purposes of blackmail, principally against other Muslims and non-Persians in the region, or at least initially. The mullahs have a great racket, bleeding their country dry and running it into the ground and sucking out the surplus. Most of them don't want to give it up. But it doesn't mean that a later regime wouldn't be much more extreme, and they'd have the same weapons. So we have to take that into account. But in the meanwhile, we'd have to live in a world where, perforce, we were polite and accommodating and agreeable to these characters. And I decline to live on those tenets. I won't do it. The best speech made by Churchill on the most overused example, of course, of this kind of compromise. But still, I think the best and one of the least known, as he finally said in one speech, it's not that one objects particularly to any one policy, internal or external, of the Hitlerite regime. It's that you basically don't want to live on the same continent as them. You don't want to be breathing the same air. And in the long run, in fact, you aren't going to be able to. One of you is going to have to yield. There is, and I think should be, so I'm glad there is, a radical incompatibility between a civilized world order which aspires at any rate to democracy and free exchange, and totalitarian, expansionist, fanatical regimes.
Did the overthrow of Saddam Hussein strengthen the Iranian regime, or is that question moot if they're simply next on the list?
If I was asked if the overthrow of the Saddam Hussein regime had the effect of strengthening the Iranian one, I think I'd have at least 2 or 3 replies. One would have to be yes in the short term. It gives it access to an audience of co-religionists within Iraq, who are by no means its puppets, but over whose leadership it does exert influence. Not all of it financial, but some of it. On the other hand, it gives them the knowledge that on their near-abroad frontier, as with their Afghan one, there are forces that are keeping an eye on them, namely ours, and we're as near to them as they are to us, if you see what I mean. You have to bear that in mind too. I have some reason to think, from talking to Iranian dissidents, both in Iran, where I've been, and in the diaspora, that when the Iranian people see free elections taking place in which Shia voters, they're not all as sectarian as that, but let's just keep it to that, and Shia parties compete against one another, they're not completely unimpressed. They don't want anyone to think, of course, that they would take an Arab country as a model. No Persian would ever allow that. But the free press, the satellite dishes and cell phones and the rest of it, these are unquantifiable. Well, that's harder to judge than the immediate influence exerted by Ahmadinejad on some Iraqi client. But they deserve to be mentioned too, and I think could equally be, not more equally be, could be more in influential in the long run. Second, do we wish to go back to a time when Jimmy Carter was encouraging Saddam Hussein to rearm in order that he could invade Iran, apparently to do the United States a favor, in a war that failed to bring down the Khomeini regime, did strengthen the Saddam Hussein regime, did strengthen dictatorial tendencies in Iran, and not incidentally took the lives of perhaps 1.5 million people and beggared the off. No, I mean, this playing off of Iran against Iraq is one of the foulest parts of our recent statecraft. What one wants is to end it by putting both countries in the control of their own people. And that might sound simplistic, but it could not possibly be worse than the competing dictatorship calculus which we operated on before.
So there's no point at which the consequences of the Iraq War would outweigh
No, certainly not. Because apart from anything else, it's invariably a good thing to see Caligula on trial in front of his own people, with Milosevic, with Charles Taylor of Liberia, the invader and attempted genocide in Sierra Leone, where we prevented another Rwanda from taking place. Tony Blair getting, I think, particular credit for that in West Africa. And with the humiliation, I would happily call it, of Saddam Hussein in front of the people who he tortured and murdered and ruined for so long, and others too. No, one can't wish that undone, of course. And furthermore, not a small thing, we can now certify Iraq as in compliance with UN resolutions on weapons of mass destruction, which we couldn't before. That's, by the way, that's a gain. Yeah. Not knowing, not being able to certify, is a great source of insecurity and instability, by the way, as well as an outrageous breach of international law.
In that neighborhood, Turkey, do you think they'll ever be ready to join the EU?
No, I don't now. Sorry, if I would have once said that I looked forward, not without misgiving, to Turkish membership of the European Union, and certainly was against some of the reasons given for opposing it, such as by His Holiness the Pope at one stage, who said that openly that a country that had Muslim culture was by definition not European. That's not true, or we better hope it's not true, say, of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, which we liberated from an attempt at their extirpation by Christian fascists, and something I'm very proud of having advocated. But the problem with Turkey, I think, is a somewhat different one. At least under its new leadership, it's already becoming the originator of unusual demands on the European family of nations. For example, at a NATO meeting held not very long ago, where it had been decided that all the members of NATO wanted as their next spokesman Anders Rasmussen of Denmark. It had been agreed. At the last minute, the Turks veto it and say, we cannot have as head of NATO someone who isn't willing to censor his own press, something Danish law forbids, in the matter of some cartoons in a paper in Jutland. Well, this is unacceptable. That's how they behave before they're in Europe. I don't like to think how they will behave when in. So a friend of mine has a very rough way of putting this, but it's, once I've said it, you won't be able to forget it either. He said, when did you last read a report from Istanbul that didn't describe Turkey as a bridge between East and West? You can't not read it, especially if it's about Istanbul. Orhan Pamuk does it. His novels are all about it. Turkish intellectuals and journalists begin their addresses to Western think tanks that way. Said my friend, it's not a bridge, it's a tunnel. Now forget that. European Union's borders will be with Iran and Iraq, actually with some of the better bits of Iraq, northern Kurdish autonomous Iraq, but we don't know for sure what can be imposed or inflicted on that area too in the future. It's not inspiring.
There's sort of an irony though, because in many ways the party in power now is more democratic. The Kemalists are more illiberal in many ways, yet they're also secular. So where do you find your place to plant your flag?
Well, in some respects, the Kemalist secularists were more chauvinistic than Mr. Erdogan's party, which at least in its early days showed signs of being somewhat more flexible, especially on the Kurdish question. Very important. It's the largest. There is another people, non-Turkish, who dwell in Anatolia. It's taken the Turks a long time to admit it, but they have begun to, and some strides of that kind of thing. But it may just be the personality of Mr. Erdogan himself, but he's a bully. And I'm not sure how tightly wrapped he is either. By that I mean he goes into tantrums. He picked, no one dislikes Shimon Peres perhaps more than I do. But the fight that was picked in public with him by early on at Davos, was purely vulgar and thuggish and opportunist. The remarks he made on the commemoration of the Armenian genocide in April earlier this